The air in the settlement of Coosa Gap was thin and heavy, with the scent of damp pine and wood smoke, a bitter perfume that clung to the rough-spun wool of Arthur Pendleton's newly tailored suit. At 24, Arthur was a surveyor fresh out of a respectable Philadelphia firm, his spectacles glinting against the low, bruised sky of northern Georgia. He had arrived on a cold Tuesday in March 1901, a stark anomaly against the backdrop of raw timber shacks, the gaunt, suspicious faces of the Appalachian. His mission was crisp and professional, to verify the boundary lines of several dormant gold claims on Blood Mountain, resurrected by a consortium of northern investors convinced a new vein lay hidden beneath the old, exhausted shaft. The Gilded Age wealth had yet to penetrate this remote pocket of the Blue Ridge, and Arthur felt the weight of that contrast immediately. This wasn't the bustling, optimistic West. This was a place where progress arrived reluctantly, if at all. Arthur adjusted the strap of his transit case and approached the only establishment that offered both a meal and lodging, a rickety structure simply named the boarding house. The wooden porch groaned under his polished boots. Inside, the single common room was dark, lit by a sputtering kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows. Three older men, their faces etched with the hard labor of a life spent in the dust and dirt, sat at a corner table, their conversation halting abruptly upon his entry. A young woman, perhaps 16, with hands scarred by chores, wiped down the counter. "Afternoon, ma'am," Arthur said, his voice carrying the unfamiliar, precise cadence of the city. "I'm Arthur Pendleton, sent down by the Atlanta office. Need a room and a meal, if you please." The woman, whose name he would later learn was Eleanor, merely nodded towards a greasy ledger. "You'll be the surveyor. We was told to expect you. Folks usually don't come up the mountain this time of year." Her eyes, a startling pale blue, flickered with an emotion Arthur couldn't immediately place. Was it pity or deep-seated reservation? He signed the book and asked, "I was hoping to speak to someone about the old Morning Star claim. I understand it's near the upper trail. Are the local guides still working?" The question acted like a physical gust of cold air in the room. The three men in the corner went rigidly still. The only sound was the low, persistent crackle of the wood stove. Eleanor avoided his gaze, scrubbing harder at a non-existent stain. "The Morning Star. That's up near the Devil's Backbone. No one's worked that shaft in years, Mr. Pendleton. Not since the accident." Arthur pulled out a chair, the scrape against the floorboard, the sudden tension. "Accident? My records only mention a rockfall closing the main entrance in the 80s. Nothing recent." A deep, gravelly voice cut in from the corner. It belonged to a man with a heavy, salt-and-pepper beard who looked like he hadn't smiled in a decade. "It wasn't Rockfall City, boy. It was bad luck or something. The mountain takes what it wants, especially those who poke at the old bones for gold." Arthur, trained in logic and verifiable facts, offered a polite but firm smile. "I'm a man of maps and measurement. I respect local traditions, but I deal in geological stability and property lines. I'm here to confirm resources, not local. I understand a local prospector, Ellis Ridge and his family, were living near the old claim until recently. I was hoping to hire him as a temporary foreman." This time the silence was a suffocating vacuum. Eleanor placed a chipped mug of coffee so hard the liquid nearly sloshed out. "Silas and his wife, Martha, and the little girl. They ain't around, Mr. Pendleton." Eleanor. "They vanished about 6 weeks back. Didn't pack, didn't leave a note, just gone. Right from their cabin near the shack." Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside air. A missing family, unmentioned in his official briefing. He pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. "Vanished? Did the sheriff organize a search? Was there any sign of foul play?" The bearded man, whose name was Jonas, finally pushed himself from the table, his movements slow and deliberate, a palpable warning in his eyes. "Sheriff looked, found nothing, not a trace. But we all know what happened. They went looking for the gold in that thing up the mountain, and the mountain claimed 'em. Folks around here say the old mine's cursed. It's a human problem, Mr. Pendleton, the kind that ends with a silent hole in the ground." Arthur looked at the grim faces surrounding him. They were not telling him a ghost story. They were relaying a grim, brutal fact of life in this isolated place. The reality of desperation, greed, and the unforgiving Appalachian wilderness was far more terrifying than any phantom. The collective fear was a physical barrier, isolating him further. "I appreciate your concern," Arthur said, his composure firm, though his heart was beginning a quick, anxious rhythm. "But I have a job to do, and I'm not leaving until it's finished. I need to get up to that shaft tomorrow morning. If the mountain is the problem, I need a guide who knows its pitfalls better than anyone." Jonas simply fixed him with a cold stare, his words like granite. "The man who knows that mine best is Silas Ridge, and he is gone." As the kerosene lamp flickered, momentarily plunging the room into shadow, Arthur felt the full, immediate weight of his situation. He was alone in a hostile, isolated environment, pursuing a profitable geological claim tied to a recent, inexplicable family dispute. The accident wasn't a historical footnote. It was a fresh wound, a raw, real mystery that had already claimed lives. He realized his simple task of surveying had just morphed into a dangerous personal investigation. His maps would soon lead him not to gold, but to the cold, dark secret buried deep within Blood Mountain. The mountain holds secrets far older and colder than Arthur realized. If you want to see what happens next and uncover the truth behind the vanishing family, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't miss Chapter 2, where Arthur confronts the chilling implications of local science. The following morning dawned gray. Arthur had the image of Eleanor's fearful eyes and Jonas's granite-hard face recurring throughout the long hour. The professional necessity of his mission warred with a rising tide of human curiosity and unease. He was a man of reason, and a vanished family was an empirical problem, solvable through evidence, not superstition. He hired a taciturn, middle-aged man named Hollis, one of the few willing to accept the risk, to take him part of the way up the mountain on a mule, promising double the usual rate. Hollis spoke only when necessary, his replies clipped and dismissive. "Did you know Silas Ridge?" Arthur asked as they began the arduous ascent, the mule's hooves crunching on frozen gravel. "Knew of him," muttered, pulling his wide-brimmed hat lower against the wind. "Good man. Kept to himself. Focused on that morning star claim like a hound on a scent. Did he ever mention trouble? Debts? Any reason to simply abandon his life?" Hollis spat into the dirt. "Silas Ridge was obsessed with gold. That's trouble enough on this mountain. And no, he wasn't the type to run. He was a fixer, not a runner. Fixed everything he touched, from a broken wheel to a leaky roof." The mule stopped abruptly at a narrow fork in the trail. "This is it. The rest is on foot. Won't take the beast closer to the gap. Bad ground." Arthur paid him, securing the promise of a return trip the next day. As Hollis retreated, the silence of the forest immediately became oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic clack of Arthur's gear and the distant rush of a creek. The trail to the Morning Star claim grew steep and choked with thorny brush, a testament to years of disuse. After an hour of challenging climbing, Arthur found the Ridge family's cabin nestled in a small, sheltered clearing. It was a single-room, timber and sod dwelling, crude but sturdy. The sight of it sent a distinct chill down Arthur's spine. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. He approached cautiously. Inside, the cabin was a tableau of suspended light. A half-eaten bowl of cold oatmeal sat on a rough-hewn table. Martha Ridge's needlework lay discarded beside a wicker basket. In the corner, a small handmade doll, the daughter's no doubt, lay face up, its painted eyes staring at the ceiling. It was the utter normalcy of the abandoned objects that was most disturbing. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no hasty packing. It looked as if the family had paused in the middle of a mundane morning and simply stepped out, never to return. A hurried flight would have left chaos. This suggested an instantaneous, quiet void. Arthur noted the details methodically. A coat still hanging by the door, a full box of matches on the mantelpiece, a stack of freshly chopped firewood outside. Nothing suggested a planned departure or violence. He moved to the small hearth. The ashes were cold, but Arthur noticed something tucked beneath a loose stone in the fireplace, a hidden cavity. A crude safe. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a small hand-stitched leather pouch. Arthur opened it. It contained 3 small, unusually dense gold nuggets and a single folded sheet of brittle paper. The paper was a hasty, almost frantic journal entry, scrawled in Silas Ridge's hand. October 14th, 1900. Martha thinks I'm mad, but the vein is there. Not the usual wash. This is pure, deep. I heard the sound today, a hollow ring from beyond the old timber shaft. The company men never got this. We are finally. I will secure the upper shaft tomorrow. I have to seal the main entrance. Too many prying eyes. No one gets this. It's ours. We will be. Arthur reread the word fixed and safe. Silas had found something valuable, and his actions suggested intense secrecy, not preparation for flight. His talk of sealing the mine was odd. It was already sealed by the rockfall, according to company records. And why hide this wealth if he planned to run? The actual Morning Star mine entrance was a short uphill walk from the cabin, a gaping vertical cut in the rock face that had been reinforced with rotting timber shoring. The main shaft was indeed completely blocked by a massive pile of slate and rock, the rockfall of the 1880s. But Arthur saw something else nearby, something the company maps failed to show. A second, smaller opening, barely visible, camouflaged by a heavy old growth of rhododendron. It was a crude, low tunnel, clearly dug by hand and recently. He pushed the thorny branches aside and felt a rush of stale, metallic-smelling air. This was the upper He ducked low and illuminated the entrance with his lantern. The tunnel was rough, barely wider than his shoulders, leading down at a sharp angle. He pulled a length of twine from his pack and tied one end to a protruding root. He would not enter unprepared. Before stepping into the darkness, he looked back at the ridge. The empty doll stared out the open door. Silas was not running from the mountain. He had gone into it, drawn by a secret so profound, he was willing to disappear his entire family to keep it. Why would a man who could fix anything deliberately put his family in danger? Arthur slipped into the narrow, man-made gap. The temperature dropped instant. The raw smell of freshly disturbed earth and something else, something distinctly chemical and acrid, hit him. The light from his small lamp illuminated the marks of pickaxes and the damp walls. He descended further, following the twine, deeper into the bowels of Blood Mountain, walking straight toward the terrifying, non-supernatural secret that had consumed the Ridge family and now waited for. He was no longer a surveyor. He was an archaeologist of a recent human tragedy, the makeshift study in desperation and single-minded labor. It was evident Silas Ridge had spent months, perhaps a year, digging this. The tunnel wasn't engineered. It was gouged, following a thin seam of mineral-rich quartz. Arthur, maneuvering his lanky frame through the tight space, was forced to put his trust entirely in the rough-hewn support Silas had jammed into the walls, another testament to his reputation. After a grueling 10 minutes of descent, the tunnel opened abruptly into a much larger, echoing cavern. Arthur stood on a narrow ledge overlooking the main Morning Star shaft, the one blocked by the 1880s rockfall. He swung his lantern around. The cavern was natural, but Silas had worked here too. A crude wooden platform had been erected near a sheer drop, and nearby Arthur saw the object Silas had used to access the mine, a thick industrial-grade steel cable winch secured to the ceiling with heavy bolts hammered deep into the rock. This was not the gear of a simple person. He descended the rest of the way via a set of sturdy, newly installed rope ladders to the bottom of the chamber. The metallic smell was stronger here, almost not. It reminded him vaguely of the chemical processes used in large city laboratories. Arthur examined the rockfall, a truly massive barrier, impassable. But Silas's note spoke of sealing the entrance, not being blocked by it. He scanned the base of the rockfall, focusing his light. And there it was, a perfectly cut, rectangular seam, almost invisible as the gray rock. It wasn't rockfall, it was a wall, professionally constructed to look like a rockfall. He felt a sudden, deep cold. This whole section of the mine was a lie. The 1880s accident was either fabricated or a convenient cover. Someone had carefully sealed this mine, and Silas had broken the seal. Arthur ran his hand along the seam. The stone was cool, but a metallic resonance answered a sharp tap. He pulled out a folding pickaxe from his pack and carefully chipped away the outer layer of mortar. Beneath the stone facade was solid, riveted steel. It was a massive, airtight safe door, camouflaged to perfection. A bank vault in a gold mine. The thought was staggering. What did the original company or the people who built this intend to hide, not just protect? He searched the small chamber, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He checked the winch area again. Tucked beneath a pile of old canvas tarps, he found what he truly feared: evidence of the Ridge family. 3 canvas-backed sleeping rolls lay neatly stacked, a small, rusty kettle, and 3 tin cups, and, most chillingly, an empty 5-gallon steel drum marked with a faded industrial chemical label. Arthur, recalling his engineering coursework, recognized the chemical formula faintly stenciled beneath the dirt: potassium cyanide, a common highly toxic agent used in the extraction of microscopic gold from low-grade ore. It was deadly. Silas wasn't just mining. He was processing gold inside the mountain, and the acrid smell in the air was the residue of the leaching process. The family had been living in a pocket of toxic air. Arthur pulled out his notebook and charcoal stick, sketching the layout of the chamber and the details of the vault door. He was no longer looking for a vein of gold. He was looking for a motive for murder or a fatal, desperate miscalculation. As he worked, his light fell upon a small metal box resting on the ledge where Silas had set up extraction material. It was a logger's lockbox, heavy, secured with a padlock. Using a simple wire, Arthur skillfully worked the old lock, another skill learned in his restless. The box opened with a dry click. It contained no gold but a sheaf of brittle, yellowed documents. They were legal papers, deeds, leases, and most importantly, a series of correspondences from the 1880s. Arthur's eyes skimmed the bold, flowing script. The documents outlined a massive, covert land acquisition project by a shadowy trust named the Cumberland Holdings, led by a wealthy, politically connected family from Atlanta. The correspondence confirmed that the Morning Star mine was never exhausted. It was sealed, the Rockford planned structural collapse, masking the installation of the steel vault behind it. The goal, to secretly hoard a specific high-grade deposit of gold, enough to drastically influence the market, until the trust was ready to deploy it. The final letter, dated 1889, was the most chilling. The local foreman and his men have been compensated and relocated. The secret is sealed. Any attempt to access the vault or even speak of the mine's true potential must be treated as a capital offense against the trust. No exceptions. The mountain will keep the silence. Silas Ridge hadn't discovered an untouched vein. He had stumbled upon a corporate conspiracy spanning 2 decades, centered around a literal vault of gold deep within the earth. His mention of being fixed and safe in his journal now took on a terrifying irony. He hadn't been securing his wealth, he had been ensuring his own and his family's fatal entrapment by working with a toxic chemical within an airtight chamber. Or perhaps the original owners had returned. Arthur stood up, his mind racing. The family hadn't vanished. They were trapped, possibly dead from the cyanide, or removed by the agents of the Cumberland Holdings Group. He was standing on the precipice of a massive, deadly secret. He needed to get out, secure the evidence, and find help. But as he turned to look up the rope ladder, his light revealed a chilling sight. A new, fresh layer of dust lay scattered across the rungs, the dust of someone who had recently descended after him. The twine he had used for a safety line lay severed on the floor. He was trapped. A cold wave of panic, sharp and debilitating, washed over Arthur. He swung the lantern wildly, casting shadows that danced like mocking figures on the cavern walls. He was cut off. The deliberate severing of the twine and the fresh dust on the rope ladder confirmed that his presence was not only known, but he had been deliberately isolated. "Who's there?" His voice was strained, swallowed instantly by the vast damps. Only the echo answered, a hollow, unnerving repetition. Arthur forced himself to breathe, recalling his training in panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He extinguished his lantern, plunging the cavern into an absolute, crushing darkness. His city-dweller eyes struggled to adjust, picking out the faintest glimmers of phosphorescent minerals on the quartz seams. The air, though stale, began to feel marginally less heavy than the chemical-laden fumes had suggested, possibly due to natural ventilation he hadn't noticed. He moved silently to the vault door, pressing his back against the cold steel, listening. Nothing, only the slow drip of water and the accelerated thump of his own heart. The person who cut the rope was likely still in the shaft above, waiting, listening for a sound that would betray Arthur's location. He spent the next hour in the agonizing blackness, his senses hyper. He reviewed the documents in his mind, the Cumberland Holdings Group, the sealed mine, the threat of capital offense. This wasn't a mountain killer. This was a well-funded corporate threat. Silas Ridge hadn't been killed by a curse. He was eliminated by men protecting a vast, illegal secret. The question was who? Was it Jonas, the grim man from the boarding house? Hollis, the taciturn guide? Or someone else, a professional cleaner sent from Atlanta, lying in wait? A low grating noise sliced through the silence. It was the sound of rock being dragged across rock, clearly coming from the upper tunnel, the one Silas had dug. The sound stopped. Silence returned, deeper and more menacing. The person was moving, perhaps sealing the entrance entirely, ensuring Arthur's disappearance was as complete as the Ridge family's. Arthur found his voice again, projecting a controlled strength he did not feel. "I have the papers, Cumberland. I know about the vault. If you close that shaft, the authorities will find me, and they will find the proof." A moment of nerve-wracking silence followed. Then a voice, low and rough, drifted down from the upper darkness. It was not Jonas nor Hollis. It was a cultured drawl, the accent of a well-educated Southern gentleman laced with a chilling clinical patience. "The authorities are 3 days' ride away, Mr. Pendleton. And who exactly do you think controls the local sheriff's office? You are merely a curious accountant who fell victim to the mountain's bad ground. A pity." The voice paused, a soft, malicious chuckle echoing down the stone. "The papers? They are interesting, but they are merely history. The vault, you have confirmed its location, and for that..." Arthur realized the horrible truth. He was never supposed to find gold. He was sent to confirm the integrity of the old claim, to ensure the vault was still hidden, secured. His northern employers were likely a front, or perhaps unwitting pawns, for the trust. "Silas Ridge found the vault, didn't he?" Arthur did, his voice trembling now with justified anger. "Did he open it? Did he take the gold?" Silas Ridge, the voice the tone hardening contempt, was a thief and a fool. He broke the seal, yes, but he never understood the scope of what he tried to exploit it, bringing his family into that chemical-laced environment. He sealed his own fate, but we had to ensure it was permanent and clean. His body, his wife, and the child were removed. The cold use of the word removed was like a physical blow. The family was dead, their bodies taken away to ensure the perfect, untraceable disappearance. Arthur scrambled to the far side of the chamber, his hand closing around the only tool he had, his folding pickaxe. "You won't get away with this. I've left a trail." "A trail that ends here," voice corrected. "Now drop the papers, climb up the rope slowly, and we can discuss a small compensation before your unfortunate accident." Arthur knew he was. If he climbed up, he would be removed, just as Silas would. He backed up against the sealed vault door. The immense steel door, the symbol of the conspiracy, now felt like his only protection. "I won't come up," Arthur yelled. "You need these papers to prove the trust's ownership in any future disputes. Without them, the claim is worthless." He was bluffing, gambling on the trust's greed, trumping their impatience. The voice hesitated. A clever gambit for a surveyor, but desperate. "We'll give you 5 minutes to reconsider. After that, we get creative." The grating sound began again, louder this time. The man was starting to block the tunnel entrance with loose rock, slowly suffocating Arthur's only path to freedom. Arthur was sealed in, with only a massive steel vault door behind him and a murderous accomplice blocking his exit. He had to find another way out, and fast, before the air or the man above ran out of patience. He looked around the small cavern, his lamp still out, trying to find a geological flaw, a second shaft, any imperfection in the rock that Silas Ridge, the fixer, might have found. The 5-minute deadline imposed by the man above was a physical weight, a stale, chemical. Arthur knew the man, or men, was testing his resolve, waiting for him to crack and surge. He reignited his lantern, deciding that the brief visibility was worth the risk. He had to assume the tunnel blocker was alone for now, a professional sent to handle the clean-up quietly. He began a frantic, methodical search of the chamber, his light dancing across the rough-hewn walls. He wasn't looking for a miracle. He was looking for Silas Ridge's signature. Silas, the man who fixed everything, would not have trapped his family in a dead-end chamber. He must have prepared a contingency. Arthur returned to the spot where the Ridge family's meager belongings were stacked. The sleeping rolls, the cups, the doll. He pushed them aside. Nothing. He checked the floor, scraping away the dust with his boot. Nothing but solid rock. He then looked closely at a seam of quartz, the same seam Silas had followed with his makeshift tunnel. He noticed a slight discoloration in the rock, a difference in the mortar, the quartz to the granite of the cavern floor. It was near the small overturned drum that had contained the deadly cyanide. Dropping to his knees, Arthur chipped at the discolored mortar with his pickaxe. It crumbled easily, unlike the surrounding rock. Beneath the fake mortar, he felt a smooth, cold edge. It was an access panel, perfectly disguised to blend with the geological texture. He was a fixer, Arthur, with a surge of desperate hope flooding his veins. He didn't just dig a tunnel to get in, he dug a tunnel to get out. He found the seam of the latch and, using the flat edge of the pickaxe, leveraged the panel open. It revealed a narrow vertical shaft, a small, dark circular tube dropping straight down. It was clearly a ventilation or drainage pipe left over from the original 1880s operation, which Silas had widened and adapted into an escape route. It was a tight fit, his only option. He quickly transferred the valuable document, the evidence of the trust's conspiracy, into the small waterproof pouch, and he grabbed his pickaxe and lantern. The man above stopped. The silence that followed was a warning. "Time's up, surveyor. We're sealing the exit. You have seconds. Choose wisely." Arthur did. He scrambled to the opening and lowered his legs into the shaft. It was a chimney climb. Using his back and knees against the cold stone, he slid his body into the darkness, the shaft barely wide enough for his shoulders. He heard the man shouting now, realizing the silence meant trouble. A heavy thud sound, and then another, the sound of large rocks being dropped to permanently seal Silas's upper tunnel. "He's gone down! I hear him, damn it!" The man above was panicking. The shaft was a dizzying drop, but Arthur used his muscle, inching downward, the fear of falling fighting with the terror of being caught. After what felt like an eternity, his boots struck bottom. He was in a small, cramped space, no more than 6 feet high. The air here was cleaner, circulating from somewhere deep in the mountain structure. He lit the lantern. He was in a naturally formed underground fissure, a narrow crack in the earth that extended horizontally. He was now underneath the vault chamber. He quickly scanned the fissure. The stone vault above was an impenetrable block of steel and rock, but the floor he stood on was loose gravel, dirt. His light fell upon a dark, damp corner. There, partially covered by a canvas tarp, was a crude stretcher and a pile of mining implements, a shovel, a few empty bottles, and a large, heavy cloth. Arthur approached, dreading what he would find. He pulled the tarp aside. There were 2 distinct depressions in the dirt beneath. They were the size of shallow graves. The heavy cloth, when unfolded, revealed a dark, reddish-brown stain, a massive, dried blood stain. Silas Ridge had been a fixer, but he couldn't fix his final, fatal situation. He had used this lower pass, but as a final, desperate place. They had either died here from the poison, or been murdered and buried shallowly before their bodies were exhumed and removed by the trust's agent. But the most critical piece of evidence lay next to the graves. It was a silver-plated watch chain, a high-quality piece of jewelry, certainly not belonging to a poor prospect. The chain was broken, caught on a sharp root. Engraved on the back of the watch was a small, unmistakable initial, J. Jonas, the grim, silent man from the boarding house. Jonas hadn't been warning Arthur. He had been the one on the ground, watching, waiting, and perhaps even committing the brutal acts of removal for the trust. The gold had corrupted and consumed the locals. Arthur heard a loud scraping sound coming from the shaft above. The man was beginning his descent, perhaps using the narrow ventilation shaft to follow him. Arthur gripped his pickaxe. He had escaped the vault chamber only to find himself trapped in a literal burial pit with the evidence of a horrific crime and a killer on his trail. He scrambled into the darkness of the fissure, praying it led somewhere, anywhere, out of the mountain. The fissure was a twisting, natural maze, a serpentine scar across the mountain's subterranean skeleton. Arthur moved on instinct, pushing himself deeper, away from the vertical shaft where the killer was descending. The geological pressure and his own exhaustion were beginning to take their toll. His head was throbbing, and his lungs burned from the exertion and the stale, mineral-heavy air. He stumbled over a piece of decaying wood and fell, dropping his lantern. The glass shattered, extinguishing the flame and plunging him into total darkness once more. The sudden absence of light amplified the terror. He scrambled in the dirt, locating the broken pieces of the lantern, then his pickaxe, and finally the reassuring, crisp crinkle of the documents in his jacket pocket. The evidence was still safe. He listened intently. The sounds of pursuit were closer now, a distinctive, heavy thudding, and the occasional curse, confirming the killer's descent. Arthur pressed himself flat against the cold, jagged rock, willing the darkness to hide him. The killer's voice, muffled and angry, echoed slightly. "Come out, Pendleton. You can't outrun the mountain. Give me the papers and I'll make it quick." Arthur remained silent, relying on the killer's inability to see in the pitch black. The man carried a gun, and any light or sound would be fatal. He estimated the killer was only about 50 feet behind him, navigating the tight fissure. He had to move. He groped along the rock face with one hand, his fingers encountering a slick, wet surface. Water. He followed the wetness, hoping it indicated a downward slope and a potential drainage out. The fissure began to narrow again, squeezing him further. He shuffled forward, scraping his shoulder against the stone. The air grew perceptibly colder, and the faint rushing sound of water became a roar. He was approaching an underground stream, or perhaps a massive open cavern. He crawled for what felt like miles, his body bruised and aching. Finally, the fissure ended, opening into a breathtaking, massive chamber, a cathedral of stone. Arthur pulled a single match from his vest pocket and struck it. The flare revealed a shocking sight: a huge underground river, the water dark and fast, carving a deep channel across the floor of the cavern. The walls were covered in glistening white stalactites, and in the center of the chamber, built upon a high, naturally formed granite pillar, was a small, crudely built stone structure, a chapel or shrine. The match guttered out, plunging the cavern back into darkness. But the brief image gave Arthur a new focus. That structure was man-made. Someone had been coming here long before the miners. He moved toward the pillar, navigating the unstable, rocky ground near the river's edge. The rush of the water provided excellent cover noise, muffling his movement. He reached the pillar and felt along the rough stone wall of the structure. It was solid, ancient, and seemed to have been used for decades. His fingers found an indentation, a small recess in the stone. Inside he felt not a relic or a religious artifact, but another small, brittle note, carefully sealed, and he struck a second match. The note was an old warning, written in the same archaic local vernacular as Jonas's earlier words: "Let the trust have the gold, for it is poisoned. There are things more valuable than riches in these mountains, and things more dangerous. We made our peace. They built their secret on the very vein of our life. Do not dig deeper. Do not awaken the deep cold." The reference to the vein of our life and the deep cold seemed like another piece of folklore, but Arthur was now looking for the literal meaning. The second match burned his fingertips, and he dropped it. The cavern again swallowed by dark. He heard the pursuer enter the main cavern, his footsteps heavy and echoing. The man was moving toward the sound of the river, using the roar of the water to mask his approach. Arthur's hand brushed against a heavy, rectangular object near the base of the pillar. It was a metal toolbox. He smashed the padlock with his pickaxe. Inside were not tools, but bundles of thick, dry canvas and several pieces of specialized modern surveying equipment, geodetic quality, far superior to his own gear, and critically a coil of industrial-grade copper wire and a small, sophisticated timing mechanism. This was a cache, hidden here by someone preparing for a very specific, technical task. Suddenly, a heavy beam of light cut across the cavern. The killer had found his own lantern and was sweeping the room. The beam caught the pillar where Arthur stood. "There you are, Pendleton," the man shouted, his voice ringing with triumph and menace. Arthur saw the outline of the revolver in his hand. Arthur immediately dropped behind the pillar. The man fired one shot, the sound deafening and sharp, a terrifying contrast to the natural sounds of the cavern. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly off the granite. Arthur now understood the fixer's back door. and the deep cold. The trust had not simply sealed the gold, they had sealed something, and the local community, the people who had written the warning, were planning to destroy the vault. He had to risk everything. With the killer closing in, Arthur grabbed the copper wire and the timer. He knew what he had to do. He had to finish what the community had started. He needed to find the vein of life and the deep cold before the killer found him. Arthur plunged into the icy water, the shock stealing his breath. The river was the only path. The killer's lantern light was a terrifying beast, sweeping the pillar and the edges of the cavern. Arthur swam, or rather thrashed, against the swift current, keeping his body low, allowing the noise of the rushing water to mask. The cold was debilitating, sapping his strength and clarity. He clung to the rock face, moving slowly downstream. He knew the man would eventually follow or find. As he moved, he ran his hand along the slick, moss-covered wall, searching. He was looking for the true vein, the literal vein of life mentioned in the warning note. Silas Ridge had found the corporate secret. The locals were planning to deal with it by destroying the vault. His fingers found an unusual, not natural, but chiseled. He pushed his body into the... It was a cramped, water-filled path, almost a swim-through cover. He struggled, finally emerging in a small side chamber, cut off from the main river cavern. He collapsed onto a piece of dry, elevated stone, shivering violently. He pulled out the coil of copper wire and the timer from the toolbox he'd managed to carry. He knew that the original mining company, or the trust, would not have sealed the gold vault without a final layer of that protection his survival. He lit the last of his matches. The flickering light revealed something extraordinary. The chamber was not for mining, but for water. Massive iron gate valves, rusted and unused, were set into the rock wall, controlling the flow of water into the mountain's network of springs and streams. And running beneath the main river cavern, directly under the Morning Star mine, was a massive untapped geothermal spring, a pressurized vein of hot water that supplied the local community's drinking water, the vein of our life. Arthur's mind raced, connecting the pieces. The trust had sealed the gold vault directly above this high-pressure water source. If the vault was breached, the subterranean pressure could be destabilized, flooding the mine, the vault, and possibly contaminating the local water supply with chemicals from the gold process. The locals didn't want the gold. They wanted to protect their life source. The cache of equipment in the stone chapel, the wires, the timer, the professional gear, was for a sophisticated, controlled detonation, not to open the vault, but to carefully breach the bedrock near the vault, using the tremendous pressure of the geothermal spring to flood the tunnel system and possibly create a large, controlled collapse that would effectively bury the vault and its terrible secret forever. The killer's voice, now much closer, echoed from the main cavern. "I know you're in there, Pendleton. The water only flows one way." Arthur had to act now. He examined the iron valves. They were old, but functional. If he opened them, he could divert the river's flow toward the geothermal spring's natural release point, creating a rapid, destabilizing pressure. He secured the copper wire to the timing mechanism, then wrapped the other end around the main lever of the central valve. He wasn't setting a bomb, but a pressure release trigger. He set the timer for a desperate 5 minutes. He found a loose, flat slate rock and scrawled a note with his last piece of charcoal, securing it to the timer. "Flooding mine. Vault is secured by the water. Tell Eleanor to warn the others about the chemical contamination. Gold is not worth this. Pendleton." He had to get the evidence and the message out. He wedged the timer or lever device into a secure crack in the rock, activated the timer, and plunged back into the dark water, this time swimming upstream against the current, heading for the surface. He heard the killer enter the chamber. A light flashed, catching the glint of the timer in the side chamber. "A wire! A damn amateur!" the man shouted, his voice laced with sudden cold dread. He understood what Arthur had done. Arthur swam with a desperate, primal strength. He was no longer running from a killer. He was racing a rising flood and a ticking clock, carrying the only evidence that could exonerate the Ridge family and expose the Cumberland Trust. The fuse is lit, the killer is closing in, and the entire mountain is about to... The suspense is at its peak. If you want to witness Arthur's final terrifying attempt to escape the mountain and uncover the full truth, you must subscribe. Hit the subscribe button right now and join the inner circle for the final explosive chapters of this true-to-life terror. The upstream swim was a brutal, agonizing climb against the relentless force of the underground river. Arthur's body was numb from the cold, his muscles screaming with fatigue. He used every available handhold, every jutting rock, to claw his way towards a faint, distant gleam of gray light, a sign of the surface he'd noted during his initial. Behind him, the killer, fueled by panic and rage, was in hot pursuit. The man's shouts were distorted by the water, but the intent was clear. He would not allow the secret. Arthur finally reached a point where the stream narrowed and angled sharply upwards into a small vertical chimney, a natural crack widened by ancient water erosion. He hoisted himself out of the icy, his body shaking uncontrollably, and began the final desperate scramble up the slippery, moss-covered rock. The timer in the lower cavern was moments from triggering the water flow. He heard a massive, echoing splash from below. The killer had entered the chimney after. Arthur scrambled faster, his spectacles fogged, his footing treacherous. He knew if the flood came, it would surge through this narrow channel, turning it into a watery grave. He reached the top of the chimney and burst out onto a small, elevated ledge hidden behind a curtain of dense ferns. The air here was fresh, cold and clean. Above him, a gap in the dense canopy allowed a meager shaft of gray daylight to penetrate. He was close to the surface. He didn't hesitate. He started climbing the final stretch, using exposed roots and jutting rock face. The soaked canvas bag of documents, his only burden. Below, the killer emerged from the chimney, his face a mask of primal fury, the revolver raised, his cultured drawl replaced by a guttural, terrifying scream. "Give me the papers, Pendleton. You'll never leave this mountain alive." Arthur was less than 10 feet from the surface. He scrambled onto a final, solid-looking root and pulled. At that exact moment, a deep, resonating thump shook the mountain. It was not a rockfall. It was the controlled, powerful breach of the bedrock far below. A terrifying, high-pitched whoosh followed as the geothermal pressure met the river flow. A massive surge of frigid water roared up the vertical chimney, a colossal geyser that struck the killer with the force of a battering ram. The man was instantly swept away, his desperate scream swallowed by the hydraulic fury of the mountain. His lantern was extinguished, and the gun clattered onto a rock face before being washed away. Arthur was wrenched from his handhold. He managed to grab a thick, gnarled branch jutting from the bank just as the surge of water, now laced with mud and debris, swept past him. He hung on, spitting dirt and water, his chest heaving until the initial waves subsided. Shaking, he pulled himself onto the surface, a muddy, hidden clearing near the summit of Blood Mountain. He collapsed onto the cold earth, gasping for air, clutching the pouch of evidence to his chest. The air here was alive with a new sound, a massive, ongoing rumble. The core of the mountain was settling. The vault, the secret, and the killer were now buried beneath tons of rock and an impassable, high-pressure flow of water. The mountain indeed kept its silence, but only after Arthur lifted its hand. After a few minutes, Arthur regained his composure to assess his surroundings alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky violent shades of orange, and he was miles from Coosa Gap, exhausted, soaked, and facing a treacherous descent. He thought of the 2 graves beneath the vault, the blood stain, and the silver watch chain, bearing the initial J. The killer was Jonas, the local, the man of granite silence, paid by the trust to ensure the removals were handled discreetly. Silas Ridge, the fixer, had outsmarted the trust's vault with a back door, but not their human asset. The gold, the secret, had poisoned the community from within. Arthur stood up, his gaze sweeping the rugged, unforgiving peaks. He had survived the most terrifying night of his life, but he knew his task was only half done. Getting the evidence out of the mountain was one thing. Delivering it into the hands of a justice system, likely compromised by the wealthy and powerful Cumberland Holdings Group, was another. And he had to get back to Coosa Gap, bypass Jonas's remaining associates, and find the one person he could trust. Eleanor, the young woman whose fear-filled eyes were the first sign that the mystery was not an old legend, but a current, brutal. Arthur spent the night walking, driven by a mixture of adrenaline and the sheer necessity. The cold seeped into his bones, and his mind, though clearer, was now haunted by the images of the hidden grave. As dawn broke, he emerged onto a wide, dusty fire-access road, miles from the main trail, but leading generally toward Coosa. His appearance, mud-caked, bruised, and carrying the marks of a brutal ordeal, caused the first two riders he encountered to recoil in alarm. They were local lumbermen, their faces immediately registering suspicion. They didn't stop, as if the news of the mountain's incident was clearly spreading. He finally reached the outskirts of Coosa Gap late in the morning. The tiny settlement was buzzing. Several wagons were gathered near the general store, and the local sheriff's wagon, a dilapidated, unremarkable vehicle, was parked conspicuously outside the boarding house. Arthur knew he couldn't simply walk in and declare the truth. The Cumberland Trust's influence was the invisible, deadly enemy. The local sheriff was likely either on the trust's payroll or too intimidated to act. He took a circuitous route, slipping through the back alleys and tangled yards until he reached the rear of the boarding house. He found Eleanor sweeping the back porch, her movements slow and weary. "Eleanor," Arthur whispered, startling her. She gasped, dropping her pale eyes widened in shock. "Mr. Pendleton, we heard the mountain took a terrible fall. Everyone said you were lost." Arthur stepped into the light, his appearance confirming their worst fears. "I need your help. I know what happened to Silas and his family. I know about Jonas." Eleanor's face went white. "Jonas, he left before the sun was up, said he had to check a trap line deep in the woods, said he might be gone a week." "He's not coming back," Arthur said grimly. "He was working for the people who sealed the mine, the ones who took Silas's family. I forced a collapse, a partial one, to bury the secret and stop them. Jonas was caught in the water surge." Eleanor put a trembling hand to her mouth. "The mountain took him then. The curse is real." "It's not a curse, Eleanor. It's greed and corporate murder. They sealed a fortune of gold inside a vault to manipulate the market, and they used a deadly chemical, cyanide, to process the ore. Silas died from exposure or was murdered to keep the secret." He pulled the pouch of documents from his jacket. "This proves it. This exposes the Cumberland Holdings Group. Dia." He noticed the kettle on the stove was boiling, and the smell of coffee was strong. "Did you hear anything unusual last night, before the collapse?" "Just the wind," she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the back door of the kitchen. "And the sheriff arrived early. He's in the kitchen now, talking to my mother, about the missing family, and the mountain noise." Arthur realized his window of opportunity was shrinking. The sheriff was here to investigate the accident, likely to ensure the evidence was buried and the narrative maintained. "Eleanor, listen to me. This vault was built over the geothermal spring that supplies your drinking water. Silas was leaching gold with cyanide right above it. When the water level rises after the collapse, a real risk of contamination." He pointed to the kettle. "Is that water from the local tap?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes filling with terror. "We only use the mountain water. It's the purest there is." Arthur grabbed the kettle and poured the boiling water into the muddy ground. "It's not pure anymore. You have to warn everyone. You have to get word down the valley to boil all their water or find a new source immediately." He handed her the pouch of papers. "And these. I can't take them to the sheriff here. He's likely compromised. You are the only person who knows I survived. You have to take this evidence. Not to the local authorities, but to the biggest newspaper in Atlanta, the Atlanta. Tell them I sent you. Tell them everything." A deep, commanding voice from the kitchen cut through their hurried conversation. "Eleanor, who were you talking to out there?" The door was ajar. Eleanor quickly tucked the heavy pouch into the apron of her dress. "It's just the old stray dog, Sheriff. I was chasing him off." The kitchen door opened, and Sheriff Tate, a broad man with a heavy mustache, surprisingly soft, calculating demeanor, stepped onto the porch. He looked Arthur up and down, a slow, predatory appraisal. "Well now, look what the mountain dragged in," his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Pendleton, is it? We heard you were lost in that terrible cave-in on the ridge." He didn't sound sympathetic. He sounded like a man who'd had his plan ruined. Arthur stood tall, despite his exhaustion. "There was no cave-in, Sheriff. It was a pressure breach caused by a concealed geothermal spring. I was lucky to escape. I've found evidence that the mine was sealed illegally by the Cumberland Holdings Group to hide a vast reserve of gold. The sheriff smiled, a thin, chilling expression that didn't reach his eyes. A grand story, son. Sounds like the lack of oxygen has affected your mind. I think you need to come inside, warm up, and let me examine those delusional claims. He took a step toward Arthur, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. It's for your own safety, of course. Arthur understood the gravity of the moment. The sheriff wasn't interested in a report. He was interested in a clean conclusion. The trust had sent Jonas to ensure the disappearance. Now the local law was there to ensure the narrative. I won't be needing any safety, Sheriff, Arthur ripped, his voice firm, though his heart hammered against his ribs. I'm sure the papers I found will explain everything, and I've already contacted the Atlanta office. They're expecting my detailed report within the day. He was bluffing, but he needed to buy Eleanor time. The sheriff's eyes flickered slightly, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The blatant lie, paired with the implied threat of external scrutiny, gave him pause. You're in my jurisdiction, Pendleton. Taking another slow. That report can wait. You're coming with me to the station. We need to document your miraculous escape. As the sheriff closed the distance, Arthur made his move. He knew he could. He quickly leaned down, picked up the discarded broom Eleanor had, and, using the heavy wooden handle, shoved it hard between the sheriff. The sheriff grunted in surprise, stumbling forward. Arthur didn't wait. He grabbed the heavy burlap sack that held the firewood and flung it into the sheriff's face. The bag burst open, showering the porch with splintered wood, blinding and momentarily staggering the larger man. "Run, Eleanor! Go!" Arthur yelled. Eleanor, already halfway off the porch, bolted into the dense thicket behind the boarding house, clutching the evidence pouch beneath her apron. The sheriff roared, wiping the debris from his eyes, his gun now drawn. He fired one shot, wildly, the bullet burying itself in the wooden door frame. He immediately turned toward the sound of Eleanor crack. "Stop her!" the sheriff bellowed, aiming the weapon. Arthur, seeing the man's attention focused on Eleanor, grabbed the only nearby object of substance, a heavy, galvanized steel bucket used for washing, and hurled it with all his remaining strength. The bucket struck the sheriff squarely on the side of the head with a sickening, metallic clang. Sheriff Tate staggered, his eyes glazing over. He dropped his gun and fell heavily, his head striking the wooden floor with a dull thud. He lay still, unconscious. Arthur stood over him, trembling, the violence of the struggle an exhausting shock to his system. He quickly retrieved the sheriff's sidearm, not for use but to disarm him. He searched the sheriff's pocket and found a thick wad, far too much for a county awfully weighed, and a small, discreet ledger. Inside the ledger were coded references to dates and payments, names like Jonas and Morningstar, and the final payment entry, significantly larger than the others, simply marked the cleanup. The local authority was indeed on the trail. Arthur looked toward the thick woods where Eleanor had vanished. She was his only hope now. She was carrying the truth and the weight of 2 murdered families on her flight path to Atlanta. He secured the sheriff with a heavy length of rope found nearby, tying him securely to one of the porch posts. He then moved quickly to the local water tap, which Eleanor had pointed out. He found a small hand pump set into the ground. He had to assume the cyanide-laced water had already reached the lower interconnected springs. He returned to the kitchen and used the sheriff's knife to carve a stark, unmistakable warning into the wall. Danger. Water contaminated. Boil or find new source, cyanide. He left the evidence ledger and the recovered silver Jonas's killers on the table next to the unconscious sheriff. The truth would be waiting for the authorities who inevitably came to investigate, and the sheriff. Arthur stepped back out onto the porch. His business in Coosa Gap was finished. The mountain's secret was buried, the local conspirators were defeated, and the corporate evidence in transit. He walked away from the boarding house, turning his back on the isolated, poisoned settlement. He didn't know if Eleanor would make it to Atlanta, or if the powerful Cumberland Trust would simply find her and bury the truth again. He didn't know if he would be blamed for the collapse, the sheriff's injury, or for the cyanide contamination, but as he began the long, hard trek down the road leading out of the Blue Ridge Mountains, he was no longer the naive, ambitious surveyor seeking gold. He was a survivor, a man hardened by the dark, terrifying truth of human greed. He had walked into a mystery and walked out of a... The most terrifying thing he had discovered on Blood Mountain was not a curse or a creature, but the cold, calculating capacity for evil that lives in men and corporations, using silence, fear, and desperation as their most lethal weapon.